I think it's best we establish the rationale for pushing this activism against GBV, as it were. Yes, the campaigns have since started. As a matter of fact, they started Monday, November 25, and the activism would end Tuesday, December 10, 2024. But the underlying issues are there, and let's talk about them. We know that today in places like Asia, places like the Middle East, we still see, and there are cases where women are killed in the name of honor. You do something, your family considers it dishonorable, you're killed. In West Africa here, Nigeria in particular, women and girls remain and have been victims of gender-based violence, incest, rape, physical abuse, verbal abuse. Sometimes girls are denied access to food. They are forced into marriages. Young girls are subjected to genital mutilation, all in the name of tradition. So, Doc, in terms of cause and effect, or causes and effects, what are some of those issues, that have not only remained stubborn, but they are proving difficult to uproot, to remove? And what are the consequences that we see today in society, playing out prominently among young women or young girls in our society?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence is a time to increase action around the need to eliminate all forms of violence that is gender-based. There are quite a number of instances globally that impact on the lives of women and girls all over the world. We call it gender-based violence and ending all forms of gender-based violence, which means that if it's gender-based, it also affects men and boys. But because the prevalence of violence impacts on the lives of women and girls more, it's seeming like we're putting out the activism to ensure that girls and women enjoy their right to life and have the deserved dignity of the human person that they deserve. If you talk about gender-based violence and looking at Nigeria as a case study, the fact that we have a Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015 in place means that there are acts of violence that needs to be taken care of. And that's why the government of Nigeria signed into law that Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015. Today we have states across Nigeria that have adopted different versions of that VAP law at the state level to ensure that there is the necessary legal framework in place to protect the citizens at the state level. But having said that, we need to understand the fact that when we talk about violence, it's not separate from cultural practices that promote actions that lead to violence against women and girls. If you take domestic violence, for example, you cannot separate it from patriarchy and power, which we are used to in the West African setting. You talk about power, you see men, holding on to the power, whether in the formal setting or in the informal setting. And women, again, are regarded as second-class citizens. While cultural practices promote this, it is not the best because it gives room for continuous oppression. And that's why when we talk about domestic violence, the law in place, which is the VAP Act that I mentioned earlier on, has provisions for adequate protection of the female. I know somebody may feel like, but women also oppress men, but the instances are small. Whether male or female, whether men or women, it is important to understand the fact that no one deserves to experience any form of gender-based violence. So the 16 days of activism, which starts on the 25th of every year, which is the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, and ends on 10th of December, which is the International Human Rights Day, is not just a global chorus, but a time to increase action to ensure that we make visible the need to have no excuses for any form of violence against women and girls. It's a time that you galvanize action, to reach out to everyone, to understand the fact that as human beings, no one deserves to be treated as a second-class citizen. No one deserves to be treated as somebody inhuman. We must respect the dignity of the human person and not perpetrate any form of acts of violence against such person. Taking it further, when we talk about the 16 days of activism, it should actually be all through the year, because
True.
if we look at the statistics, according to the United Nations, UN Women, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, 1 in every 3 women have experienced one form of violence or the other. Why do we still record this in our society? This is a global statistic, and Nigeria is not an exception. And that's why I would say that there is need for increased awareness on the need for people to understand that they should have respect for one another, that removes any intention to perpetrate acts of violence. Look at the number of cases we've seen recently when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. You see that a number of cases of incest have been recorded. Why are we having such in our society? You see a number of cases of rape. Why do we need to continue to tolerate that? So this calls for action, and it should be a continuous call for action. If we look at it now, this year 2024 is the year preluding the year that the Beijing Platform for Action will turn 30 years, with 12 critical areas that is speaking to the need to continue to protect women and to also ensure inclusive participation of women, because you cannot talk about ending violence without also empowering women, or without giving the opportunity for women to also participate actively in the governance space. If you recall, during the COVID-19 lockdown, there was a global rampage on the extent to which violence was perpetrated against women. In fact, in Nigeria, a state of emergency was declared, because the lockdown now showed the kind of people we are, by the extent of violence being recorded. Why would a lockdown, restriction of movement, lead to an increase in violence? It was not only in Nigeria that we recorded this, it was a global phenomenon. And that particular year was the year that the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action turned 25. So it calls for a lot of deeper reflections.
True.
Deeper reflections in the sense that why was it on the increase? By just mere restriction of movement, bringing together of husband, wife in the same physical location at the same time for almost several months. So we need to look deeply at this, and to also refreshing our strategies, by re-examining what has worked in ensuring that violence should stop against all persons, and what has not worked. We don't want a society where girls will be afraid to go to school for fear of being raped or defiled. We don't want a situation whereby there's consistent domestic violence. There's no peace at home. Remember that the home, the family, constitute the unit of that society that reflects on the kind of larger society that we have.